London No.3 Surprise Royal. What is it? Why is it number 3? What are the other ones? Why is this one the one we ring? And how should you learn it? Let's find out. First, let's remind ourselves about London Major. Here's the grid. There are some distinctive pieces of work. The fishtails here in 5, 6, and 7, 8 when the treble's doing its 3/4 dodge. There's this little bit of front work with a Stedman whole turn and the beginning of second space bell, which is familiar from London Minor as well. And that's quite distinctive. And this shaded part here is really as much wrong hunting as possible underneath the treble. And those seem to be the distinctive features of London Major. And the place bell order, 2, 3, 5, 7, 8, 6, 4, the reverse of plain bob. So it's natural for ringers to want to extend methods onto higher numbers. And in 1907, this method was rung, which we now call London No.1, but at the time was just called London Royal. And you can see that it's got this London Major feature of as much wrong hunting as possible below the treble, but the fishtails have disappeared, or they've turned into these stretched out, very long fishtails. These are what I would call a 4 spike. It's like a fishtail, but you do 4 point blows in the far place. And second space bell doesn't start in the expected way from London Major. So not everyone was happy that this should be London Royal. And in 1926, the method we now call London No.2 was rung in Brighton, and it became known as the Brighton version of London Royal. And what you can see here is not quite as much wrong hunting below the treble. We've got some other kind of work in 5, 6, 7, 8 around the half lead here. We've got ordinary fishtails in 7, 8, and 9, 10, but not in 5, 6. And second space bell is back to its distinctive start, fitting in around the Stedman whole turn on the front. But still not everyone was satisfied. And in 1933, this method was rung by the band in Beddington in Surrey, and it became known as the Beddington version, but this is what we now call London No.3. And in the 1930s, the Beddington band was one of the leading 10-bell bands in the country, and Charles Kippin here was the leader of the band. And after ringing a peal of London No.3 Surprise Royal in 1933, they went on to ring the first peal of Bristol Royal in 1934. In 1935, they rang the method we now call Superlative No.2. Now, Superlative Royal had been rung in 1826, but the Beddington band didn't like that version. We now call it Superlative No.1, and Superlative No.2, which they came up with, is now considered more standard. In 1936, they capped it all by ringing a peal of spliced London, Bristol, Cambridge, and Superlative, which was not the first peal of Spliced Surprise Royal, but when it was published, it was noted as the first peal in the standard 4 Surprise Royal methods. So those were considered a good collection of methods, perhaps inspired by Pitman's compositions of London, Bristol, Cambridge, and Superlative Surprise Major. Unfortunately, there aren't systematic records of the composers of methods. And the first peal of London No.3 was conducted by Charles Kippin. The peal was composed by Frank Darby. And I don't know which of them came up with the method itself, or indeed whether it was invented by someone different. Now, if we have a little look at the grid, we'll come back to this in more detail later, but we can see that we have got the distinctive fishtails in 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 10, and the trebles in 3, 4. We've got the distinctive beginning of second space bell and the Stedman whole turn on the front. We've got some treble bob work at the back, but the wrong hunting on the front doesn't extend all the way up underneath the treble. We've got some other kind of work here in 5, 6, and 7, 8, and that's something we'll look at more later on. So 3 versions of London Surprise Royal. But ringers didn't stop there. By the way, all of these methods have the expected place bell order for an extension of London 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, 8, 6, 4. In 2000, a band rang a method which they called London No.4. And again, it all looks pretty similar, but in 5, 6, and 7, 8, underneath the treble at the half lead, we've now got these double wrong dodges. So that's a new feature. Everything else looks pretty similar to number 3. 2016, we've got London number 5. And this is the same as London number 4, except some different word in 5, 6, 7, 8 underneath the half lead. And by the way, there's nothing magic about the fact that all these names are called London number something. They're just names. The method collections don't include the concept that some methods exist in multiple versions. The name of London number 3 is exactly that, London space NO full stop 4, and that's it. So if you wanted to, you could find an unrung surprise royal method of any kind, not necessarily related to London, and you could call it London number 6 or London number 7, whatever you want. It would be a bit silly, but it would be possible. And London number 4 and number 5 also have the expected place spell order. But there are other methods which have been given slightly different names, sometimes London-themed names, and these are also more or less similar to what we expect from London. So here for 2005 is a method called Londres, or perhaps Londres, if you prefer Portuguese to French. And the main difference here is, again, around the half lead, where we've got double wrong dodges in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, and then some kind of places going on in 7, 8. There's a method called Ludgate, which goes back to 1954. Again, pretty similar, and its distinctive feature is some fishtails in 5, 6 below the treble. So if you like the fishtails in London, here's a method that's got a few more of them. And Londres and Ludgate both have the expected place spell order as well. But why isn't there a 10-bell method which just follows the extension rules from London Major to give us a, if you like, official extension? If you look up London Major on Composition Library, complib.org, it will tell you what extensions exist. And there are 2 10-bell methods which are extensions of London Major according to the current definition of method extension. Neither of them has been named so far. Here's the first one. You can see it's got a lot of wrong hunting below the treble. It's got fishtails at the back, but when the treble's in 5, 6, instead of when the treble's in 3, 4. There's also a lot of wrong hunting around the lead end on the way to and from the fishtails. But this method doesn't have the expected place spell order. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on. It's plain Bob place spell order. So that looks rather different. And for that reason, it might not feel quite so much like London to ring, regardless of what the line is. But still, that might not be too bad. If you know Bristol Royal, you know that it doesn't have the same place spell order as Bristol Major. The second conforming extension is this one. And this has the fishtail in 5, 6 below the treble in the same way that Ludgate does. So that could be another interesting method for someone to ring and name. Finally, if you don't mind changing the place spell order in your London-like 10-bell method, here is Metropolitan, which was rung in 1952. It's got fishtails in 5, 6 and in 7, 8 and 9, 10, but they're not all happening at the same time as each other. They've become offset. And the place spell order is actually the same as Cambridge. And there are other methods with London-like features. There's King's Norton, which is London backwork, and it's something different on the front, and again, plain Bob place spell order. There's Triton Delight, which is London number 3 backwork, and has some more fishtails on the front. And probably there are other methods with London-like features. But London number 3 Surprise Royal is the one that's become standard. And if someone says they're going to ring London Royal, then in the absence of any information to the contrary, what they mean is London number 3. So let's have a closer look at that. Here is the grid again, and we can see that we've got these fishtails in 5, 6 and above when the treble's in 3, 4. We've got the perhaps unexpected appearance of Yorkshire places in 7, 8. This might not be what you expect to see in a London-like method. It doesn't correspond to anything in London Major, but because it's a well-known structure in its own right, that's quite a helpful feature when learning London Royal. And the other really new aspect is this little bit of work in 5/6 with a place and a point blow adjacent to it. And this is one of the things that you just have to learn when you're learning London Royal. And this little bit of work, I don't think it even has a standard name. So let's look at some place spells, starting with seconds place spell. And for comparison, I've put London Major next to it on the right. And you can see that these are extremely similar. The only difference is that in London Royal, seconds place spell has been padded out by hunting to fourths and back to lead an extra time. And apart from that, the line is exactly the same as London Major. So that's very easy to learn. The same thing happens in thirds place spell. You've got an extra fourths and back. And a good tip for both seconds and thirds place spell and their reverses, fourth and sixth place spells, is that whichever one you're doing, you always lead twice. Now, the line for thirds place spell, London Royal and Major don't look exactly the same, because in Royal, we go all the way to 9-10 for a fishtail, whereas in Major, thirds place spell is one of the ones that does this distinctive bit of London backwork that you'll also know from London Minor. But this fishtail here would really like to have been in 9-10 in the first place. It's just folded over here because there wasn't room for it to go any higher up. So these are really the same work, and it's all part of a backwork pattern, which has got a fishtail when the treble's in 3-4, and treble bob work extending a little bit away from that. Fifth place spell is next. It starts off in the expected way, thirds on the way in, stepping on the front, and now we've got this distinctive sixth point fifths, and then you go up to the Yorkshire places. As I said, I don't think there's a standard name for this sixth point fifths. I just think of it as sixth point fifths. When you're reversing this place spell, breaks place spell, of course it's point fifths, sixths. And one of the problems with trying to find a good name for this piece of work is that it's not symmetrical. So you would need to think of it differently depending on which direction you're going in. I said this is Yorkshire places here. Purists might point out that this is not exactly Yorkshire places because there's a dodge with the treble and the places are below the treble, and that doesn't happen in Yorkshire. Your Yorkshire places below the treble in Yorkshire don't involve the treble at all. So you could more strictly think of this as the below the treble part of Cambridge places, or you could think of it as Pudsey places because they do occur in that way in Pudsey. But it seems harmless just to think of this as Yorkshire places, and that's what a conductor might tell you to do if you're uncertain at that point. It's also worth noting that the dodge that isn't with the treble is at the half lead. That's a good landmark. Fifth place spell then goes up to do exactly the distinctive London backwork, again because the fishtail that would like to be higher up has to fold over. And there we see that piece of work. Seventh place spell again starts off in the expected way from London Major with that fourth dodge thirds to get past the treble. And then it goes up, and this is the other place spell that does this new bit of work in 5-6. This piece of work in 5-6 now looks as if it could be starting off like a cat's ears, but halfway through, the second point turns into a dodge and it becomes like a little piece of treble bob work. So again, you just have to learn this. The 5-6 dodge is at the half lead, and you have to remember that you just hunt straight up after doing the 5-6 dodge. Even if you're not a handbell ringer, it can be useful to look at how different place spells interact with each other when learning a method. So here I've put fifth and seventh place spell together, and you can see the way they work together coming up through 5, 6, and 7, 8. That the point fifths in fifth place spell fits around the point sixths in seventh place spell. They're dodging in parallel, one just above the other at the half lead, and then seventh place spell runs up through the Yorkshire places that fifth place spell is making. So this is something very familiar from Yorkshire, running through the places that your core spell or your after bell is making. This is very helpful. And then you can see both bells going into a backwork pattern, which has got some treble bob work and eventually a fishtail when the treble's in 3-4. Finally, ninth place bell is quite an easy one. It reverse hunts down to a fishtail in 5-6, and then it's into quite a long stretch of treble bob work. And it makes ninth under the treble at the half lead. And what that means is that it gets this extended back work which is exactly the same as in Pudsey, if you know Pudsey major. The ninth place bell is the symmetrical place bell, the pivot bell, and then everything reverses, and you can check the lines in relation to the comments that I made on the place bells from the first half of the course. So in summary, key points for London Royal, apart from its fascinating history and the time it took for ringers to settle on what exactly should be the standard version of London Royal. Use the similarities with London Major to help you learn it. Notice the structure of wrong hunting and fishtails, because this really is fundamental to the method, and also continues if you ring London in any of its forms on 12. And there is some new work in 5th, 7th, 8th and 10th place bells, this work in 5, 6 and 7, 8, which you just have to learn and remember. And that's all.